As we are going to do a very quick review of evolution and talk about how it relates to biodiversity. So, your standard for this lecture set is theme 3.1, in which natural systems change over time and space. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify types of evolution based on characteristics, explain and describe the ways in which organism interactions influence evolution and adaptation, and predict rates of evolution using mathematical models such as the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So the first thing that we need to talk about is how we understand the mechanisms of evolution. And we're going to tie this back to the idea of genetic biodiversity. So the different kinds of genes, different kinds of genetic information that is found within a particular species. So genetic biodiversity is measured in terms of genes and alleles. So if you remember back from general biology, a gene is simply just a piece of coding DNA that gives the instructions to produce a particular kind of protein. Different genes may work in different ways. They may work collaboratively. And we're going to go very simplistic in our explanation here. So for example, you have a gene that codes for the color of your eyes. An allele is a variation of a particular gene. So the gene says you're going to have an eye color. The allele determines what the eye color is going to be. It might be blue, it might be brown, it might be green, it might be gray. Somewhere in that area. So we're going to look at genes and we're going to look at alleles. And all of the genes that exist for a particular species are part of their gene pool. The broader the gene pool, the more variation of genes that there are, the more genetic biodiversity there is in a particular species. Genes and alleles may be described in terms of being dominant or recessive. So for an allele to be dominant, that simply means that the effect is shown when there's only one copy of that allele. So you only need one of them in order to have brown eyes. Recessive occurs when that particular trait needs two copies of the same allele. So you need two blue alleles in order to have blue eyes. And dominance and recessive plays into what we know as your genotype and your phenotype. So your genotype is the combination of alleles that you have. So you may have two dominant alleles. You may have two recessive alleles. You may have one of each. Your genotype influences your phenotype, or the physical manifestation of your genetics. And so the mechanism of evolution that we really understand today, thanks to the work of Gregor Mendel, Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace, and several different individuals throughout the 1900s, is the study of genetics. And we now know that genetics is really the driving force behind the understanding of evolution. So when we talk about your genotype, we have three different ways that we can really describe your genotype. And we use these terms homozygous and heterozygous. So if you have two copies of the same allele, regardless of dominance or recessiveness, you are said to be homozygous, meaning you have the same copy. If you have two different alleles, you are said to be heterozygous. Notice here in this diagram, we're looking at simple dominance, simple recessiveness, and therefore the heterozygote, they have one copy of the dominant allele, and therefore they show the dominant phenotype. So it's important to understand that evolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population over a given period of time. And the shorter the generation time, the shorter from birth to reproduction, the faster your evolutionary rate is going to be. In some species, like bacteria, insects, you may see evolution occurring very rapidly from a human standpoint. In humans, however, generation time is much longer. Therefore, evolution is going to occur over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. It is important to know that individuals do not evolve, only populations evolve. So, one of the biggest factors that affects evolution is this idea of natural selection. And natural selection is the biggest mechanism of evolution as we understand it today. So, natural selection works on phenotypes. So, those physical manifestations that are more adapted or provide some kind of survival advantage become more common in a population. And a change in phenotype is going to change your genotype, because if you look here at the diagram on your right, the birds really like green beetles. Green beetles get eaten more, therefore they do not survive and reproduce. So the orange beetles have a survival advantage. Their phenotype becomes more common, and then underlying their genetics become more common because they're the ones who survive and reproduce. When we talk about natural selection, we also have to talk about this idea of fitness. In terms of evolution, fitness is defined as being able to survive and produce viable offspring. In other words, get your genes into the next generation. Organisms who cannot produce viable offspring or who have not yet reproduced are not considered evolutionarily fit. So, evolution can also cause this process called speciation. And speciation is the development of two new species from a parent species. And in terms of our discussion, a species is a group of similar organisms that are able to mate and produce viable offspring. So there are four common types of evolution that are going to either cause dramatic changes in a particular species or result in the formation of two new species. And these four common types of evolution are divergent evolution, convergent evolution, parallel, and coevolution. So divergent and convergent evolution occur in the same area or the same ecosystem. And parallel evolution occurs in two very similar ecosystems. So the organisms have similar pressures on them, but they may not necessarily be in the exact same place. So divergent evolution is going to really cause that speciation. It's going to be where two different species diverge. Convergent evolution occurs when the selection pressures on a particular species or two separate species cause them to move closer together in terms of their genetics. And parallel evolution is when two organisms with similar selection pressures develop the same adaptations. There is a fourth type of evolution that is not pictured in this diagram, and that is coevolution. Coevolution occurs when two organisms, often in some kind of predator-prey relationship, evolve together in response to the changes in the other. So, for example, you have a plant and a caterpillar. The caterpillar eats the plant. Some of the plants in that species are able to produce a substance that is toxic. It kills the caterpillar when it eats it. Therefore, those plants don't get eaten. The ones that can produce the toxin become more common. Some caterpillars in that species are able to digest the toxin in the plant. So those caterpillars can eat the toxic plant, they survive, they reproduce. Now, the ability to digest that toxin becomes common in the caterpillar species. Every time there is an adaptation and there's an adaptation to an adaptation, you have this kind of one-upmanship. One is trying to outdo the other. And this leads to what is called the evolutionary arms race. Both organisms in this relationship are trying to outdo the other in pursuit of survival. Additionally, you have these species interactions that affect evolution. So how two or more organisms impact each other can determine how they evolve. So there are several different kinds of interactions, and we describe them in terms of how they affect one species and how they affect the other. So you have mutualism, competition, predation, commensalism, amensalism, and neutralism. Please note that in competition, there is interspecific, meaning that is between two different species, and intraspecific, in which you have competition within a particular species. Please make note of these, make sure that you understand what's going on in terms of the interaction between the two different species that are involved. Lastly, we have to look at how we understand evolution as occurring. And because of the big time frame that it takes for evolution to occur, we have developed several mathematical models that can predict different frequencies of alleles, of phenotypes in a population, and we can actually go out and measure them. We can do some capture release, look at genetic studies, look at phenotypic studies, and see if what we predict is actually what we see. And if there is a difference between what we see and what we predict, then we say that evolution is occurring or has occurred in that particular population. The most common model for this is the Hardy-Weinberg equation. There are two equations that feed into this. The first is P plus Q equals 1. And this is where P and Q focus solely on allele frequencies. P is always used to denote the dominant allele. Q is always used to denote the recessive allele. The second equation, which you get when you put P and Q in a Punnett squared, is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. In this case, each of those values denotes a specific phenotype. So P squared is the frequency of homozygous dominance. 2PQ is the frequency of heterozygotes. And Q squared is the frequency of homozygous recessives. Both of these equal 1 because all of your terms in there will be in decimal points. So now we're going to work through a very simple problem that you can do to figure out how to use the Hardy-Weinberg equation. Given just very few pieces of information, you can do a lot with the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So we're going to assume that there are 450 individuals in a particular population, and 175 of those are recessive. Okay, so there are a couple things that you can figure out here. What you can figure out is that the 175 out of 450 is actually your Q squared. So Q squared is equal to 175 divided by 450. So it's the number of individuals that have that particular genotype, that particular phenotype, out of the total number of individuals in the population. And that gives us a frequency of Q squared of 0.39. Okay, so we figured out what Q squared is in that equation. Given that, we can find everything else. So we have Q squared. We can find Q by doing the square root of both of those. So Q is equal to the square root of 0.39, which is going to give us 0.62. So what that tells us is that 62% of the alleles in this population are recessive alleles. Now we can figure out P. Remember that equation, P plus Q equals 1. So we know what Q is, so now we can simply find P by doing 1 minus 0.62. And that's going to give us a value of P being 0.36. So we know now that 36% of the alleles in this population are dominant alleles. So now we can find out the rest of that. So we have that other equation, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. We already know the Q squared in that equation. Now we can find the next one. So P squared is very simple. To find P squared, we simply take 0.36, which is our frequency of the dominant allele, and we square it. And that's going to give us 0.13. So that tells us that 13% of the organisms in this population show the dominant phenotype, or are homozygous dominant. The other thing we can find is 2PQ. There are two ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you just the easier way. The first way to do this is literally just plug and play. So P is equal to 0.36. Q is equal to 0.62. And you multiply all that out, and you end up getting 0.46. The other way that you can do this is add Q squared and P squared together and subtract from 1. You should get the same number. So what we see here is that 39% of our population show the recessive phenotype, meaning that they have their homozygous recessive genotype. 13% show the homozygous dominant phenotype and genotype. And 46% show the dominant phenotype, but their genotype is heterozygous. So you see here, given just a small piece of information in the Hardy-Weinberg equation, you can figure out a lot of different mathematical information. You should now be able to identify types of evolution, explain ways that organism interactions influence evolution, and predict rates using the mathematical model of the Hardy-Weinberg equation.